What's going on, everybody? Welcome back. We're on to a new episode, and this one sits at the heart of my car, the fuel bladder and the fuel system. Now, this is my brand new fuel cell from FuelSafe. We're gonna be installing in the car, but before we do, we're gonna have to add some parts to it, because one major thing I changed is I went from the giant 2-inch filler neck, and I'm gonna be using a -8 line that has a dry brake on it to fill it. So we've got to put in a bulkhead fitting for now, and that requires taking the top plate off. So we're gonna get after it. So while I'm putting this bulkhead fitting in, I figured now's a good chance. If you like this video, please hit the like button. And if you really want to see more of what we're doing, please subscribe. It really helps us out. Now, obviously, there's one thing we won't get to. And besides putting in the bulkhead fitting, we're not going to have any more of the feed into the tank installed during this video. We've got to make a bracket for it to go onto the frame to locate the dry brake fitting. But we're going to cover everything else. I'm looking forward to showing you and giving you a lot of information about my thought process and how I like my fuel systems. So FuelSafe obviously made a couple of changes for me. One being converting to the 8 fitting or the 3/4 inch line to feed the fuel cell, but there's two other things I asked them to do for me as well. One of the main ones is there is an actual surge tank built into the bottom of my fuel cell. Now, surge tanks are great because if you think about it, there's a lot of room on the bottom of my fuel cell. What this will do is these little one-way trap doors will allow fuel to slosh or surge into the smaller area and make sure that my fuel pump always has fuel in it, or at least it does a better job. Now, to tie that in with making sure that the return line that comes to my fuel cell gets fed back into the surge tank as well, you do a better job of closing the fuel system and making sure that you don't find yourself running out of fuel. So thankfully, my fuel system really doesn't end up being that complicated. Besides the fuel bladder, the hoses and fittings, these are all the additional components I've got to build into my system. Now, we've got simple things like your fuel pressure regulator, we've got a fuel pressure sensor. We also have 2 dry brakes. This dry brake here is going to be for the filling of my fuel system. This is the 8 fitting that we put in the car. We've also got this secondary dry brake, and as you can see, it's not really going to be a part of the system. That's because with S.C.C.A, they require you to have a way of sampling the fuel that's pumped out of the vehicle. So we're going to need to put this towards the back of the motor so that at national competitions, they can plug in and get a P sample basically to make sure that I'm not running cheater fuel. Now, everybody runs a fuel filter. This fuel filter in particular, though, is one that I'm planning on using. And that's because for Spec Racer Fords, this is the spec fuel filter. And so if I ever had a problem where I needed a replacement fuel filter or I needed some sort of component that this wasn't working, there's a lot of them out there. There's a lot of them on cars, and there's a lot of guys with spare filters. Any CSR for Spec Racer Ford in the country will have a spare filter, probably at the track. If they don't, they definitely have them in the shop. Now, the last little thing is this. Now, this is a bit inconspicuous, but I'll show you where this goes right now. So this beautiful little fitting right here goes in my factory Suzuki Hayabusa fuel rail. So this takes the place of the odd adapter that comes out at a 90-degree angle. It takes some standard OEM style fitting, but now it's just replaced with an aluminum block with a 6AN fitting, so I get to do a lot better and cleaner job building my fuel system, taking kind of this ugly standard factory piece out of the equation. And it's going to make it simpler. It's going to not necessarily make it safer, but the connection is going to be something that's made safer, so it's less likely to be a fuel fire. So circling back on the gold foiling we did a couple of episodes ago, that's not the only protection I'm going to try to deliver to my fuel system to prevent it from getting warmer with the exhaust being so close. Case in point, here's a coolant blanket. Now, we're going to have a bigger one that basically covers the entire back of the bulkhead so the fuel cell does not find itself pushing up against any of the metal that touches the firewall that's exposed to the heat of the headers. This goes a long way to not only preventing any kind of danger when it comes to heating your fuel bladder, but it also just does a really good job of isolating out heat from transferring both to the fuel bladder and the fuel itself. So without further ado, we should start putting parts in the car. Now, normally I would start with the fuel bladder itself, but I've test fitted that in and out of the car a couple of times. The one thing I want to locate first is my fuel pressure regulator, so I'm going to get started on that. So as you can see, I'm using my automatic hole punch here, and we're going to drill some holes for some pop rivets. Pop rivets just are my favorite way to attach a metal bracket to a panel. So here you can see I'm doing an example of clecos, and I didn't really do a good enough job, but we'll get that in a later video. But boy, do they make your job easier when you're trying to drill a hole, line up a second one, drill it. Now, one of the things I did decide to use steel pop rivets and these washers to make sure that it has the most clamping force possible. With how far out or how cantilevered the fuel pressure regulator is, I wanted to give these rivets the best chance of holding on to this bracket. Now, of course, there's screws that hold the regulator in place. Like just about everything on this car, I love a little bit of blue Loctite, especially on stuff I never want to see come loose. I can always service the regulator in the car. Now we can get started on the actual fuel bulkhead fitting. I did tape on the backside, and now we're just drilling a hole for me to be able to pass the bulkhead fitting through the panel. Now obviously it comes with washers and a jam nut, and we're just making sure it's lined up and tight right here. After cleaning the metal floor and the surface that I sit on, I'm ready to install the fuel cell. I'm using my old blanket just so I have the spacing, and you saw I put that X of tape. Now we'll get the engine back installed, because in order to really run the fuel cell properly, we've got to be able to put on the throttle bodies and have everything where it needs to be. Now we just get to start making fittings and measuring out the hose. We're gonna actually throw an audible here, but I'm hoping that just having a dry brake in the line is good enough to satisfy the rules in regards to the fuel P-test. We're going to check that a little bit later, but for now, it makes it a little bit simpler of a fuel system out of the fuel cell. Now, obviously, this is how I do my hoses. Don't call OSHA. I could have the vice clamps, but I don't do enough lines to really justify the investment. I would have lost those clamps anyway, considering I only do lines probably once a year. So even though I'm not completely happy with how the fuel filter's in right now, this might be how it's permanently home, or I might have to change how the fuel leaves this T, goes through the fuel filter, and then goes to the bulkhead fitting. But for now, I'm just going to walk you through what's happening here. Now, first and foremost, you'll notice that I'm actually taking the feed through the filter. This will go to the actual engine itself, but most importantly, it's getting fed out the side, and there's a straight shot that goes up. This goes to the fuel pressure regulator. So let's just say for whatever reason I do pick up air or just get a burp in my fuel system, my hope is that it will bypass the fuel that goes to the motor and go straight through the fuel pressure regulator first. Obviously, you can always have a big enough burp that you will get a bog or some sort of fuel delivery problem, but hopefully by making it so it bypasses vertically first, that might help prevent an air bubble from finding its way through the regular fuel system. One of the other things, you'll see that I'm filtering first, fuel pressure second. So that will hopefully let me know, like, if you didn't have the fuel pressure sensor behind the fuel filter, you could theoretically be having great fuel pressure up to the point of the fuel filter, but have a clog in the fuel filter and not be able to deliver that fuel to the actual fuel rail. So running the fuel pressure sensor after your fuel filter is a better way to make sure that you're not running into any kind of restriction or blockage. The only thing that could restrict my fuel flow at this point after that sensor is the dry brake fitting itself. And that's going to wrap up this video. I know it's a simple little fuel system, but it's a fuel system nonetheless. It's a short video, but a sweet one. I hope you learned something. Obviously, we're going to move on to another fluid system in the next video, i.e. the brake system. So if you want to check that out, hit the subscribe button and we'll make sure you see that next video. But if you like this video, please hit the like button. It's really helpful. And in the meantime, have a great one. We'll see you in the next video.